Hey folks, now my feelings on this movie, like my feelings on most media, and like my personality and identity in general, I'll admit come from a slightly bizarre angle. In this case, the angle is that I had actually not seen the original two films, 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later, until recently either, just shortly before watching the new one 28 years later. I know, look, they were on my to-watch list, but watching the trailer for 28 years later is what gave me that final push to sit down and watch the first two films. And I'm glad I did, because now, don't get me wrong, I know this is probably going to be historically charged. I don't know if it is, but I get this feeling, just hear me out. I kind of think that the first of these movies, 28 Days Later, is kind of the OG Walking Dead. Now, I promise I am not accusing Robert Kirkman of anything intentional or malicious. I'm just saying there are quite the overwhelming plot and characterization similarities. And I don't mean just that they both begin with the main character waking up from a coma to find that zombies have taken over. Now, I might as well just go ahead and completely rip the Band-Aid off and say something even bolder, which is that I kind of think that 28 Days Later makes a reasonable substitute for The Walking Dead if someone who has not experienced that series does not want to deal with its length. And I would not blame them, because as great as that series is at its heights, it does drag on and get stale. The TV so much more than the comic. I finished the entire comic. The TV show I stuck through for more of its duration than I think most people did, but eventually I just had to tap out. 28 Days Later, though, is a short, tight, self-contained story, and everyone's character arcs resolve satisfactorily. Now, I know it sounds kind of weird that I would say self-contained because of the next two films, but each of these three films so far has a different cast of characters. I did not like 28 Weeks Later as much as the first film, but I didn't dislike it. There were some things I vibed with even more than the first film. For example, the heightened sense of tension, because this time we were seeing the beginning of an outbreak with the resurgence of the AIDS virus as opposed to the aftermath of it already happening. You know, that sort of made me jump in my seat at a few times more than the first movie did. My problem with it, though, was that the characters didn't seem to be there so much to have their own arcs, but just to move the plot from point A to point B. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I've seen and read stories where that was also the case, but I didn't mind it. It's just that here I don't think it was worth the payoff. Especially when you consider, and here's where I'm going to just get into mild spoilers, that 28 years later doesn't do anything with the way 28 weeks later ended. But I don't think it was retconned, though. A lot of people are saying that. I disagree, because 28 years later starts with text saying that the infection was contained, but that doesn't mean that 3 infected people didn't crash in their helicopter on Paris soil. It just means that they might have contained that too. Now, is that likely? No, but is that any less realistic than anything else in these movies or in similar movies? Also no. Besides, after my husband and his cousin and I walked out of the theater, we had to talk about how we thought it was interesting that the story has the UK being quarantined instead of like every other zombie story does, at least almost every other zombie story does, with the whole world being infected. Because yes, there is more you can do with that if it's more widespread, but the fact that it is contained in the story just makes it different. It takes different angles that you couldn't with other stories, and that is a bit refreshing. I do kind of wonder why the rest of the global community didn't just nuke the place, but that's a nitpick. And God forbid we give them the benefit of the doubt about exercising some morality in this crisis. Well, excuse us, princess. But enough about that. What did I think about the new movie, you ask, about 28 years later? At risk of sounding anticlimactic then, I don't think I can form a complete judgment on the film yet, because, it's part one of a trilogy. What I can say for certain, though, is that I am damn glad that I remembered that just before I sat in the theater seat to watch it, because, oh boy, this does not work well as a standalone story. It almost does. It comes close, but it just doesn't. And I'm going to explain why in a moment. But I do also first want to emphasize that for what it is, for a first chapter, a part one, the beginning of a new story, it does its job well of hooking me in and making me want to know what happens next. And I think that may have had something to do with how pleasantly surprised I was, because this film took a wildly different turn than I was expecting. And I promise I'm only sticking to the smallest of spoilers, but what I mean by this is how in the very beginning, the main character, the young boy Spike, he's having this kind of coming-of-age ceremony. He's going to go on a hunting mission, a supply run on the mainland from his island community for the very first time. And he's told by one of the elders that no one from their community is allowed to go searching for anyone who is missing on the mainland. As soon as she says this, I immediately guess that the first mission that he goes on with his dad, Aaron Taylor Johnson's character, is going to go awry. Somehow Aaron Taylor Johnson is going to end up back on the island while Spike is fending for himself on the mainland, and that somehow his dad is going to just, defy the community's orders and go back for him. If you've seen the movie, you know that is not even close to what happens. And yeah, if that's what happened, I think that might have been better for suspense. But I'm glad it didn't go that way, because like I said, where it did go, I was not expecting, and I think that made it a bit more unique and memorable. Now, it is true what a lot of people have said, that there is a major tonal shift between the first and second acts. But I know why. Of course, if you have issues with tonal shifts in movies or stories in general, that is something to keep in mind. I'm just saying that I could clearly see what the purpose of the tonal shift in this film is. That's because whereas 28 Days Later, at its very core, was the story of a found family and how their love for each other is what helps them overcome the odds to live in this horrifying new reality, 28 Years Later, at its core, is about a young boy's coming of age. And Spike learns a different thing in each half of the film, and the order in which he learns them makes perfect sense. In the first half, it's just about him learning to survive, to kill zombies, to hunt for food, to live off the land, all that good stuff. Because yes, if he lives in this environment, that should be step one. You have to learn those skills. It's like something else that was said in a similar film, not one that involved a zombie apocalypse, but a monster, alien apocalypse, let's say, A Quiet Place, where Emily Blunt says to her son, "You just need to learn these things to take care of me when I'm old and have no teeth." It's in the second half of the film, though, after that shocking swerve of events, where Spike learns not only to deal with the fact that death is still inevitable, but how to value and appreciate life. And it's done in a way that's sentimental without being sappy. And that's very difficult to do, so I respect that. And I feel like it's pretty obvious that this is why Spike's dad disappears from the second half of the film, because he can teach Spike survival skills, but he cannot teach him those finer details about life, those finer life lessons, if you will, at least not yet, because He is clearly dealing with his own personal demons. We figure out pretty early on, not immediately, but pretty early on, that he has a lot of psychological baggage to unpack. Without giving anything away, he is not handling what's happening to his wife very well. He's not processing it like he should. And you can tell that this is the beginning of a character arc, whether it's one of redemption or of a failed effort to do so. We can just tell that it's going somewhere. And this is the only reason that I don't think this stands well as its own story, just as the first part of the story, because we know they're setting that up with him, they just didn't do anything with it yet. I only have one other problem with this movie, and yes, it's the one that everyone else has. You've probably already heard of it. The parkour, punk rock, zombie hit squad, who are the grown-up versions of the kids who in the beginning saw all their parents get eaten by zombies. They were a little too silly. Now, was I as repelled by their inclusion as most of the audience seemed to be? Probably not. And here's why. Think about a post-apocalyptic scenario. And let's face it, a lot of people would probably just have fun with it. Think about the people who you interact with on a day-to-day basis and how many can just be chaotic, unhinged, just do whatever they want. And this is where society is more or less still intact. Now take something happening where all the strappings of polite society are stripped away all of a sudden, and what do you think the traits already in those people are going to be dialed up to? Yeah, exactly! And I think that for a story in this genre not to address that in any way, shape, or form would be a bit disingenuous. Now, I still think that their presence in future installments might still end up clashing too much with the overall seriousness of the story's tone, but I'm actually more worried about they're being one-dimensional. To bring this back to The Walking Dead, I just don't want them to be a rerun of Negan and the Saviors, where their whole point is just how violent and sadistic they are. Because we have a pretty good idea that they're violent and sadistic because, in the first act when they're on the mainland for the first time, you see the body they left up hanging for the infected. So yeah, we know they do some pretty bad stuff. But I'm hoping that maybe the ones who do get fleshed out characterization, maybe they end up doing something more like a Jinx from Arcane thing, where yes, they're mentally unstable, but there's still humanity. And maybe Spike himself could be the one who sort of helps them bring out their humanity. That seems to make sense with where his character arc is going. Another thing I just have to point out that is not even a nitpick, there's nothing wrong with it, I just think it deserves a warning, that some of the infected, when they run, they look just like some of the Titans in Attack on Titan. And I refuse to believe, without overwhelmingly compelling evidence otherwise, that this was not intentional. That's fine. It is what it is. Just if you're a fan of Attack on Titan, you're going to be a little distracted. You might be taken out of the story for just a moment, but it'll be fine. It won't be distracting for too long. That's all I just want to say about that. And one thing that I hope they do some point in the next two movies, and I know there's no indication, no evidence of this whatsoever, but I hope that we find out exactly how that island community came to be right at the beginning of the outbreak, and how maybe they did something that was a really dick move to keep everyone else from the mainland out of their community once they, reached a number of people. Like I said, no, there's no reason to believe that happened. I just kind of hope it did, because I really like that revisionist history trope. And if everyone else outside of that community, besides Ralph Fiennes' character, the doctor, who's cool, is just an absolute feral criminal cult member, then that's gonna be a little reductive, a little othering, don't you think? And I think that would be a good way to avoid that. Like, okay, not everybody in this horrible situation is all good or all bad. They're all just trying to survive. With all that said, I'm at least glad that I watched all three of these movies, and two out of those three I enjoyed very much. So I think those are pretty good odds, and I'm really looking forward to the next one. I'm glad that the next film comes out pretty soon, in January of next year, but if the wait between the second and third films is a bit longer, then that just means they've got to cook, and that's fine. And with that, I bid you farewell, and you take care.